Hallowed Ground Storycast. I'm Alan.
I'm Anya.
And I'm Dr. Paul Moffat, and this episode is about my fathomless fixation on Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory.
It is a shame for you to say him such worship.
So excited to have you on, Paul.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
We go way back with you in a way because you got in contact with us when we first started our first podcast, Shadows and Shamblers. And you had your own podcast going, and you were like, "Hey, how about some cross promotion?" And so that was the first way that I found out about you, and I've followed you for a long time. I've taken some of your courses, and so like for people who don't know who you are, you have a PhD in medieval literature, and you've done poetry. You're a musician. I don't know if you put this in the notes that you're a dilettante and put that word in my mouth. But I've loved your podcast that you did with your wife, Jan, who's come on our show way too seriously. You have other podcasts, Halfway Expert, Popular Opinion. You run Clockwork Academy. So you're like an internet mogul.
A lot of minorly listened to and successful stuff.
I'd completely forgotten about that cross-promotion thing. That was Clockwork's Cast, the Legion podcast.
That's right. We thought American Gods and Legion had similar vibes. And so I was like, well, if we could introduce listeners to each other, that would be good.
I have this like very clear memory of after you sent that email to Alan, listening to Clockwork's Cast as I was driving 10 hours across Croatia and Serbia.
That's right.
Oh, wow.
Because I drove to Belgrade to visit my friend who's from Serbia.
Yeah, Clockworks was a podcast we did about the TV show Legion that ended when the TV show ended, and that I did with my wife Jan. That was a lot of fun. We started it at about the same time as we started Way Too Seriously, which is a podcast about kids' movies that has kind of become... It didn't officially end Way Too Seriously, but it's kind of defunct because our kids have gotten older. We used to watch a kids' movie once a week, and then we would discuss it, and now we don't watch them. We still watch a movie with our kids, but now they're like, they want older kid movies, and it just doesn't fit the brand anymore.
Yep.
Okay, well, let's get back to the topic at hand. So, Paul, what is a good plot summary of Le Morte d'Arthur? Like, what do we need to know to kind of understand what's going on?
I'll give you the colophon at the end of the book that summarizes it according to the first publisher, William Caxton. He said, "This is the end of the noble and joyous book entitled Le Morte d'Arthur, notwithstanding it treateth of the birth, life, and acts of the said King Arthur, and of his noble knights of the Round Table, their marvellous quests and adventures, the achieving of the Sangreal, and in the end the dolorous death and departing out of this world of them all." Which is to say, it's about King Arthur, and it's called Le Morte, but it starts before he's born, and it goes on for a while after he dies. All the things that you know about King Arthur really come from Le Morte d'Arthur. So the Sword and the Stone is in there, Lancelot and Guinevere and their love affair, the whole quest for the Holy Grail. That's the plot of Le Morte d'Arthur, and then they all die at the end. But it's not so much because of tragedy. I mean, it is tragedy, but it's also just because they keep telling the story until it's over.
I mean, It has to end with their death, otherwise it would just still be going.
Exactly. I remember once reading John Steinbeck, reading a couple of Steinbeck novels and thinking, like, his books are so depressing, everyone dies in the end. And then suddenly realizing it's not really that he's depressing, it's just that he tells the story until it's over.
It's their whole life, yeah.
It's their whole life. So everyone
Right.
always dies at the end of a Steinbeck novel, not because he's especially depressing, but because if they're still alive, he has more story to tell.
Mm-hmm. It's not like it ends in a giant apocalyptic battle. I mean, for some people it does, but it does like just continue to go on. And then there's like, oh, and then they're in a convent and, you know, on and on and on and on until it's on their deathbed. But it is like very, I found it very emotional and cathartic to get to those endings this reading. Like I spent so much time with all of these characters And sometimes it can feel pretty distant because of, it's like hundreds of years old writing style. But then, like, Lancelot's on his deathbed and he's telling people stuff. And I'm like, Lance, oh, God, buddy, you really messed up at the end there. But it did, like, deliver something that I was like, wow, this has, like, a lot of emotional punch. I can see why it's been so potent in the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is absolutely one of the things that keeps drawing me into Le Morte d'Arthur and keeps me so entranced with it. The whole book, but especially the ending, is very emotionally real, and the characters are very human. We have especially... this is a bit of a chip on medievalists' shoulder, because there is a narrative that says that interiority was invented in the Renaissance. No one usually says it that directly, but, like, people talk about the Renaissance is the time when people discovered that they were full, whole, deep humans, and Shakespeare is the first... I mean, I have seen this not said by... I've seen this said by, like, kids shows, but it still is a meta-narrative that, like, Shakespeare was the first playwright who wrote about his characters with, like, realistic depth as humans. And, like, that's not at all true. One of the stereotypes against medieval literature is that it is flat. And then when you read Le Morte d'Arthur and the characters are so human, and there is so much pathos, and the ending especially when they are... like, they have made mistakes, and they have made not mistakes, but they are dealing with the mistakes of each other and of others. I mean, they've all made mistakes, but, and they can't undo what's been done, and they're all very human. And even, I'm saying Renaissance because that's what I assume people know, but we don't say Renaissance, we say early modern, because Renaissance implies a rebirth of some light that had gone out, and no, it's not a rebirth of anything.
Well, the word Renaissance, was that applied by the people in the Renaissance? Like, was that a self-congratulatory label, or was that put on after the fact by other people?
It's a retrospective labeling. I mean, there were many Renaissances from, like, the 12th century until the 16th century. There were many small Renaissances when we look back on them, but at the time... I don't know. I'm a medievalist, not a Renaissance scholar, so I don't know when the first word Renaissance gets used, but not in the 16th century yet. We'll talk about Le Morte d'Arthur lots, but just in terms of medieval literature in general, what draws me to it and has drawn me to it is this, like, interplay between, in some ways, the Middle Ages are like an alien land where everything is very foreign, very unfamiliar, and at the same time, it is so familiar, and I really enjoy that interplay between, like, there are cultural assumptions that are very different from 21st century Canadian cultural assumptions, but individual human emotion is the same, and so people react in a whole range of ways, and writers represent that in a whole range of ways, and so Mallory is my favorite that I've been fixated on, but any medieval literature has, like, shows you the depth of human emotion in very, what are often very moving ways.
And so, speaking of the past, let's talk a little bit about the production, creation history of Le Morte d'Arthur, and a little bit more background context, because I'm not sure if all of our listeners are going to know that.
In terms of history, background, and context, one of the things to know before I go back in time is that Le Morte d'Arthur has for centuries been kind of the King Arthur text. And there are other ones written and they go back to Le Morte d'Arthur as their text that they compare themselves to and check. And if you want to be authoritative, you check Le Morte d'Arthur. And if you want to be radical, you go do something different from Le Morte d'Arthur, right? It's the text that is the Arthurian legend, especially in English, for centuries. In the 15th century, Le Morte d'Arthur was written in 1469, 1470 by Sir Thomas Malory. We don't know very much for sure about Sir Thomas Malory. We know because he's Sir that he was a knight, and there's a few places in the text where he refers to himself as a knight prisoner. And then people have done some historical work to make guesses of, there's a couple of Thomas Mallorys who were alive at the right time. Not all of them were knights, not all of them are known to be prisoners. So there's one that we think probably was the Sir Thomas Malory who wrote Le Morte d'Arthur, but he wasn't famous at the time. He's not a Chaucer who, was a public figure while he was alive. Sir Thomas Malory was not that. And Le Morte d'Arthur is it's a mix of translation, collection, and new writings about King Arthur. So there's a couple of very influential works about the legend of King Arthur in French, and then a few more in older English. And Malory takes the French ones mostly, translates them into English, intersperses them with bits from the English, intersperses them with a little bit of his own original stories, maybe some stories that weren't original, we don't know, there's no source known. So there's some that are for sure original to him, there's some that we don't know if they're original, there's some that a lot that we for sure are not original, and he puts it all together into one story. Le Morte d'Arthur is written, as I said, in 1469-1470, but it was published in 1480 by William Caxton, who was the first publisher, the first printer in England. The printing press was a new invention. Caxton brought the printing press from Germany to England, and he is the first publisher in England, and for a while the only publisher in England. Caxton's successor did a new edition. It has been continually printed ever since. It is the only... more Arthurian people like to say this. You could... who knows how verifiable this is, but Arthurian people say this all the time. Le Morte d'Arthur is the only work of medieval literature still widely read by non-specialists for pleasure. And that's partly because it is relatively late, so the language is not modern English, but it is so close to modern English that a non-specialist can read it and understand what it is, whereas like 10 years earlier, you'd have a lot more trouble. But so for centuries, Caxton's edition is the edition that is known. And what Caxton's edition is the whole book from beginning to end. And it's in chapters like a modern novel, and it's each chapter is separated into sections, so it's separated into books and then chapters and then sections, and each section is a couple of pages long, and that gives it this momentum and makes it feel a lot like a modern novel feels. In June of 1934, in Winchester Library, the Winchester College is what we would think of as a high school in England. They were reorganizing the library, and they have an archive, and they had manuscripts in the archive that weren't known. Some manuscripts, because it's a really old building and a really old library, they have some manuscripts that aren't labeled. And one of the schoolmasters, Walter Oakeshott, found a manuscript. It started in the middle. It wasn't labeled, but he had recently been reading Le Morte d'Arthur, and he recognized that it might be Le Morte d'Arthur. It was known, people who read it could tell that it was about King Arthur, but it wasn't starting on page 1. So that's how the explanation for how it could be there for so long and not recognized. He read it and he recognized that it was Le Morte d'Arthur, but it was different from Caxton's edition. And so that led to like an explosion of interest, and the preeminent Arthurian scholar of the time, Eugene Vinever, came to Winchester College to look at it and studied it for years. And the conclusion was the Winchester manuscript was an older manuscript that is written with pen and ink instead of on vellum instead of printed. It was older than Caxton's edition, and it was different from Caxton's edition. So after centuries of Le Morte d'Arthur being a thing, in the 1940s, Vinever published a new edition based on the Winchester manuscript instead. And based on Vinever's study of the Winchester manuscript, Vinever thought, Mallory never intended this to be one story beginning to end the way Caxton presented it. Mallory structures it as a collection of 8 tales that are published in one book, that are bound together. Published is the wrong word for a manuscript, but they're bound together in one book. The same way that you can find manuscripts that have very different tales by different authors together bound in one book. Like, that happens all the time.
Like an anthology or something.
Like an anthology or something, for sure.
It's something that I was thinking when I was reading it. I was thinking about like the Grimm's Tales or something like that. And this is exactly the kind of thing that I was wondering is like, what was the structural intention? If it was meant to be like this linear, story, or if it was meant to be like, here are collected legends thereof.
Caxton wrote a preface to his print edition. And in his preface, he said, "This guy, Mallory, came to me with a book and I took it and edited it and gave it titles and gave it chapters and put it all together in one book." And for centuries, people basically were like, is that really true, though? Because, and that sounds like, well, why would you not believe him? But he also says in his preface that, like, various gentlemen from England came to me and said, "You must publish a book on King Arthur." And I said, "How could I possibly? Because Arthur's not real." And they said, "Here are all the proofs why Arthur is real." And then I said, "Well, someone happens to have just given me a manuscript." Like, he does not present it in a very plausible way.
It's like destiny. Yeah, I see.
So who knows what's true and what's not? But basically, people thought that he was, maybe he gave the chapter titles, but people thought that he was exaggerating about how influential he was on the structure. And then when the Winchester manuscript was discovered in 1934, Vinaver really argued strongly that Mallory did not write one book. He wrote 8 tales. And that's why there are characters who show up in one tale, who die, and then in another tale are back again. And there are characters who seem to be really characterized. One, like Gawain is a great example. He's sometimes this heroic warrior, and then sometimes he's like a very sensitive romantic, and then sometimes he's like driven by wrath, and sometimes he's honorable, and it's kind of all over the place. But if there are 8 different tales, then he's consistent within each tale, and then it's just a different tale. That's Vinaver's argument. I actually think Vinaver overstates his case. And also that the concept of artistic unity in the way that Vinaver wants to imagine it wouldn't really have occurred to Mallory. Like, the question of, did you write one book or 8? Mallory would be like, I don't understand the question.
Aren't there like 16? He'd be like, I wrote 16. What are you talking about? Yeah.
And if it's like one book, what do you mean? If it's in one
right
binding, it's one book, right? And they're all about Arthur, so it's all the same thing. But there are different stories, of course. There's the story of when Lancelot climbs up a tree, and there's the story of when Lancelot goes swimming. Those are 2 different stories. Like, I don't really think Mallory would understand the question.
Okay, so I have a question. When have been thinking about this book, I keep coming back to the concept of fan fiction in terms of like just trying to put it in a context that I can understand for like what he was doing, like taking these well-known characters and then kind of like putting his own spin on it. You could imagine, right, that you would have like a single fan fiction author who writes multiple stories, again, in the same universe, but they don't necessarily have to be consistent with each other, right? They can be slightly different takes on the same characters.
Right. You can easily imagine an author who wrote 1,500 pages on the adventures of Jean-Luc Picard and Data and Riker, and the characterization is mostly the same, and it's the same world. But if story number 1 and story number 20 contradict each other, they would be like, it's the same.
Yeah.
It's the same world. And if you asked that person, did you intend to write one book? They might be like, yeah, the book of stories about the continuing adventures of Starship Enterprise.
Right.
But is it one unified artistic unit beginning to end? Like, I don't know, man.
Yeah, so this was exactly the kind of thing that I was wondering of, like, what was Mallory's project? But I guess from what you're saying, we don't really have good insight into this. Of, like, what I was thinking of, like, the Brothers Grimm, who are, like, self-consciously kind of, constructing an ethnography, based on, like, folk tales, who are, like, they're not trying to, like, smooth out, make, like, a nice narrative. Like, some of the Grimm's tales, you read them and you're like, wow, this is boring. Like, it's badly rendered, like maybe the bones of the story are okay, and then other stories it's like, wow, this is evocative, like I'm sucked into this. And it had to do with, like, who was telling the story, like the actual person that they're taking dictation from,
Right.
Whereas Mallory feels more like this is all of a author, if that makes sense. Like it all is consistent in its style, so I don't feel like, like, was he trying to take, like, these are the ones that I think are legit, and, like, like leaving out, because he says at the end, he's like, some things I left out because they're not legit. And so, like, what I have here, this is the good stuff, and don't worry about, or like other times throughout the manuscript, he's like referencing, as it says in the book, like, we all know the book. And I'm like, Mallory, what are you talking about? Like, so, I don't know.
He famously, throughout Le Morte d'Arthur, Mallory again and again says the French book, as the French book saith, the French book. And there's one point, for example, where he goes and we're in the context of the sword in the stone. The sword in the stone is in an anvil in the yard of the greatest church in London. And then Mallory says, and whether that's St. Paul's or not, the French book maketh no mention. So, like, he specifically is like, I know it's the greatest church in London. Is it St. Paul's? The French book doesn't say, right? His references to the French book are not intended as, you shouldn't think of those as, like, I'm not going to mention stuff because it's in the French book, so I don't need to. You should think of it more as him citing his sources, as him saying, right, like,
this is why it's confusing, because, like, I'm like, yeah, so is he, like, giving us a translation for Britons, or is it like,
yes and no.
Yeah, or this is, like, definitive because I have good judgment.
So so when he says the French book, he is citing a source. He's saying, and the French book is something that people might know of. Like, there's more than one. He uses more than one, and there are more than one known. But if you were a learned French-speaking reader, you would always know which French book he's in at any given moment, because he stays quite close to it. And if you weren't, you're aware that there are French books about King Arthur, and so he's citing his sources. But he's doing it disingenuously, because it's not true. Like, he is using French sources, and a lot of his writing is straight translation, but a lot of it isn't. And it is, you cannot tell, based on how often he mentions the French book, you can't tell whether you're reading a part that is a straight translation or not. He's not accurate about that. Because his reason for citing his sources, like, and this is a medieval concept of authorship, right? Post 17th century, post the Romantic era with a capital R, we in Europe and European descended languages have really fetishized originality. And, like, an artist is a real artist if they created something directly out of their brain, and the more inspired by their own individual genius, the more it's real art. And if it's inspired by anything that someone else has ever done, it's derivative and they're not real artists. Right. And we still carry the weight of those kind of assumptions in the 21st century. Like, we still kind of feel like, well, a translation's not real art because you didn't come up with it from your own, like, it didn't ex nihilo your own genius.
But in the Middle Ages, makes it legitimate, right?
Exactly.
Now. Yeah.
Yeah. But in the Middle Ages, that was not at all the assumption. It was the
Right.
opposite, right? If you
Yeah.
wanted to slander an artist, you would say, you are just making that up.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so funny that it's like, it's just a completely different way of viewing like art and what counts as like high versus
yeah, because
low
they're
art.
like, who are you to say this?
Yeah.
You know, like, yeah, you're a nobody. Yeah, Chaucer had the same
We see
problem.
that
He was like, I
exactly.
totally, yeah.
All over
He's
Chaucer.
like, I totally
Chaucer's
got this from somewhere
very
else.
conspicuous
It's very
about
funny.
it.
Yeah,
Like, Chaucer is always denying his own creativity.
it's really funny.
And Mallory does that too, because that's like a basic assumption of what an artist, what an author especially does, is
I see.
you're telling the story, not necessarily, I mean, I do not think that he would, that what he is insisting on is the historical accuracy of this, but he's insisting on the artistic legacy or the faithfulness to the tradition,
Mhm.
right? So I think, so we can't know what Mallory's artistic project is, and in the whole Vinegar debate, one of the tacks that some people arguing against Vinegar take that I am sympathetic to is, who cares what Mallory intended? He's gone.
Right.
All we have
Right.
is the
Yeah.
book,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, and you even get a really fun death of the author pun. I mean,
Yes,
well, like, death of the author is a pun on this book.
it is. That's right. Because Death of the Author, written by Roland Barthes in French, is Le Mort d'Arthur, which is a pun on Le Mort d'Arthur. So in French, the original essay that is translated, The Death of the Author, is a Mort d'Arthur pun. You said earlier that all Le Mort d'Arthur feels like it's of a piece with the same style and artistic voice. And people who read it really closely don't think so. Because one of the criticisms that people make of Mallory is that his style tends to be whatever style he read latest.
Which I
he's-
totally identify with.
Yeah,
Like-
for sure.
So sometimes I'll be writing and just like so annoyed by the fact that it's like, oh God, I was last reading this person and I'm like way more sarcastic than usual or whatever.
I think like there's a middle ground. I don't think that sometimes people have said that Mallory has no style of his own. He just like adopts whatever style he's reading. You can detect the style of his source. And it's especially evident in the Grail section. His source for the Grail section is probably written by a clerical author, Cistercian monk, who was really emphasizing the religious allegorical aspects of the Grail. And there's a whole long thing to say about that. But so in the Grail section, there keep being hermits that show up and explain to the knight what just happened and what it means.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, whoa. Yeah, it felt like a homily or something
Yeah.
of like, yeah, somebody explaining the allegory of this.
And Mallory cuts that down a lot from his source, but he still leaves in a lot of it anyway.
Mhm.
And then the other section is the Roman War, which is early in the book. Is his source for that is an English instead of a French text. He doesn't use a lot of English sources, but his source for the Roman War is English. And his source is an alliterative poem. And so suddenly he starts alliterating a lot. And he doesn't reproduce the alliterative poem. It's not in verse, but he will write long alliterative lines and even add his own alliterations that weren't in the original poem. If you read a version based on Caxton's edition, the Roman War is much, much shorter in Caxton's edition than it is in Winchester's edition. So you might not have noticed that depending on what edition it was that you had. But in the Winchester edition, what the big difference is, one of the huge differences is that the Roman War is, 2 or 3 times longer.
I did want to ask about that. Like, did English people really think that they conquered Rome at one point? Or is that just like a happy fantasy that they knew was a fantasy? Or, yeah.
It seemed like he kicked down the door and it was like, stay off my island. I don't owe you anything. And then he's like, you better be glad that I don't want to conquer you. And then left.
So it sounds like you read Caxton's edition, because Caxton downplays the Roman war a bit. In the Winchester edition, he absolutely conquers Rome. He kills the emperor.
That's crazy.
He conquers Rome. Rome is now give truage to Britain and most of Europe on the way to Rome too. And I would say, to answer your question, Anya, that like I would not attribute historical naivety to medieval people. That on one hand, they don't have access to historical sources as nearly as readily as any regular person does now. And they also are not, certainly not all of Mallory's audience are historians. But on the other hand, I don't think that they're any more likely, that medieval Britons are any more likely than modern ones to confuse fantasy for history. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I am positive there are some people who read this and are like, yeah, Britain once conquered Rome. That's definitely true. And I am positive that there are some people who read it and they're like, what a nice story. King Arthur wasn't real.
It's like, that's cool. Right. He's like subverting real history and it's like a fun little twist.
Now, in Mallory's source, Arthur loses at that point and does not conquer Rome. So Mallory didn't think that he was writing history. He didn't even think he was being faithful to his source. Mallory changes things around so that Arthur wins the Roman War.
Interesting.
In his source, the Roman War happens right at the end of Arthur's life, and he's about to conquer Rome when he hears news that Mordred has usurped his throne and married Guinevere, and he has to go back and fight Mordred and then die. But Mallory moves the Roman War to way early in Arthur's career so that he conquers Rome and then goes home and everybody's happy, and isn't it great? Arthur is Emperor of Rome now.
It does underline his potency. Yeah, he's very ascendant in the early part of the story, and then, or at least in the version that I read, Arthur and especially Merlin kind of drop out of the story, and it really just follows the Round Table Knights for a long time.
Yeah, that's not just your edition. That's
just how it is.
Yeah. That's for sure.
And, you were saying fan fiction earlier, Anya, and it was really that part. I think I sent you a message about this where I was like, this reminds me of reading comic books, where if you try to get into comic books, it's like impossibly difficult because there's like, where do you start, right? Even if you start at the beginning, it doesn't make any sense. And what I found, and I guess we haven't yet gotten to our first experience of this book.
I think this is a record for like amount of time before we, in theory, finish our introduction.
Yeah,
sorry.
It's okay. No, this is great. I love this discussion. I've read this book a few times now, and like comic books, what I have found is that the more I run into the characters, the more associations I build between their like relationships and stuff. And so like I'm able to be like, oh, Sir Gawain, who is related to King Arthur as like his, and oh, right, Galahad is the son of Lancelot. They're not like competing knights who are peers. They're like directly related in this way. And this is this person in the same way as like you run into a character in a comic book and you're like, oh, right, their backstory is blah, 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 blah. And that gives you like a network of context for the story. And so like, I could imagine that these stories were being told by illiterate people who are like, telling these, and it's almost comic book in the way that it's told too sometimes, where it's like, meanwhile, we will set down this thread of the story and we will go over here. And you could kind of imagine that people know who Sir, whoever is based on like all the other stories. And you don't have to like fill in the backstory to be like, oh, those two are brothers when they show up. Like maybe it'll be mentioned, but it's not necessary in the same way as in a comic book. You don't have to reference all the times these characters have had adventures together to like get the history of everything that's going on.
Right, for sure. And also when two knights meet, they are likely to fight each other.
Yeah,
even when they're ostensibly on the same side.
For no reason. Yeah, exactly. Because they're in different colored uniforms.
Because you have to see fighting. How their power levels match up.
Totally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Mallory does do a lot of, ranking of, the greatest knights in the world. He's the greatest, and there's a lot of mentions of Lancelot, Tristan, and Lamrock are the three greatest knights in the world. And then you'll have another knight who, is the greatest except for Lamrock, Tristan, and Lancelot. And then sometimes Gawain gets thrown in there, but he's not really in the same caliber as those three.
I like Gawain. I have such a soft spot.
A lot of people do. Gawain, especially in the back half, is such a very human character with so much emotional nuance that it is hard not to like him.
So before we jump into our first experiences with the text, I did just want to touch on a conversation that Paul and I had earlier to prepare for this podcast about the idea of Mallory and Le Morte d'Arthur as a bottleneck for Arthurian legend, because I found that concept really helpful for thinking about just the role that it plays in Arthuriana more broadly, that it's there was a bunch of stories being written and passed around before Mallory, and then he kind of consolidated it, organized it in a way according to his views and aesthetic, and then everyone who came after Mallory is referencing him in some way as how they're measured against him.
Yeah, for sure. There are tons of Arthurian stories that predate Mallory. When I said earlier that, Mallory is the text, I say that, but that isn't just me. It's Arthurian scholars for centuries, consciously or unconsciously, you read pre-Mallory things through the lens of did Mallory use this or not? The sources that Mallory used are important because they're Mallory's sources. And I think most of them would be important anyway. He's using a lot of the major sources that tell the story, and he's not just picking them out of thin air. But the pre-Mallory text that is Arthurian that doesn't fit into the Mallory bottleneck is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
I was going to ask you this because I was expecting it to happen. And then at a certain point, I was like, where was the Green Knight? What?
But other than that, there are a lot of Gawain stories that predate Mallory, and non-specialists don't care about them. And even specialists often have thought about them in a different category from the sources that Mallory uses, because he's a bottleneck for Arthurian legend, both after Mallory. If you want to write the authoritative version, I said this already, but you either are looking at Mallory or you are deliberately subverting him. In the same sort of way that after Dracula was written, if you want to write a vampire story, you are not ignoring Dracula. You're either writing something that's Dracula-like, or you are consciously subverting Dracula tropes, but you're not ignoring Dracula.
It's the Mount Fuji effect. Yeah. Either your painting is of Mount Fuji or it's on Mount Fuji.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so Paul, what was your first experience with King Arthur generally and with Le Morte d'Arthur specifically? My
mom read me Arthurian stories as bedtime stories. That was my first experience of King Arthur. Probably the two, there's Rosemary Sutcliffe has a collection of Arthurian stories that now when I look at them are very clearly grounded in Mallory and are children's versions of Mallory stories. And The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White was the other one, which is very explicitly based on Mallory. So I read those as children's stories. My mom read them to me. She was always really interested in Arthur, especially, I didn't know this as a child, but especially Tennyson. She was into Tennyson and the Idylls of the King and the Lancelot Guinevere romance when she was a teenage girl. So King Arthur stories were like one of the narrative backgrounds of my childhood. And then when I went to university, I studied English. I wanted to do more. I wanted to do a master's degree. I had to decide what it was going to be on, and I had a lot of different things floating around that I might do. And I was going to write about Hamlet. I still like, but I used to love Hamlet. I used to sleep with a copy of Hamlet under my pillow because I was pretentious.
That's amazing.
That's cute. I like that.
As in like high school, man. Jeez Louise. Yeah. Anyway. But then I thought I might write my master's on Superman, because that was my other fixation. And Superman is, by the way, a fixation I did not get until I was studying literature. Like it is not, unlike King Arthur, it's not a childhood interest. But I was going to write about Superman and superhero comics and King Arthur. And I thought I would write my master's on Superman and King Arthur and something about adaptation theory and like,
oh wow,
how you can be like, how come everyone in the world knows who Superman is, and what's the authoritative version of the Superman story, even though it's been written hundreds and hundreds of times and they contradict each other. And then what's the authoritative version of King Arthur, even though it's been written hundreds and hundreds of times and they contradict each other. And my master's supervisor said, like, okay, that's a bit much for a master's thesis. Can you narrow it down? So
I love that idea. Man.
Through a process of narrowing, I said, okay, what if I just do the Arthur thing? And what if I compare King Arthur in a bunch of different texts? And my supervisor said, narrow it down more. I said, okay, what if I just do the Fairy Queen and Mallory? And he said, okay, narrow it down more. So I said, okay, what if I just do Mallory? And he said, narrow it down more. And I said, okay, what if I do just do Holiness in Mallory? And that's what I ended up writing my master's on. And then I went and did a PhD. And I said, okay, now I'm going to do Superman and Arthur. And my PhD supervisor said, even for a PhD, this is too much. So then I said, okay, back to the Fairy Queen and Mallory. The Fairy Queen is a 16th century Arthurian text that is very, very different in how it imagines Arthur to how Mallory does. And I was going to write about Fairy Queen as a post-Reformation Protestant text in contrast to Mallory as a pre-Reformation Catholic text, even though calling it pre-Reformation and Catholic is anachronistic because they didn't know they were pre-Reformation.
Right.
And you can't be
like
Catholic before they're Protestants. But I was going to be like, look at how they represent what it means to be holy so differently and what it means to be a good king so differently. And my idea was, I'm going to say that Mallory says you cannot be faithful to God and an efficacious king at the same time. Those are mutually exclusive. And that's the point of the Grail quest. And Spencer in The Fairy Queen says those are exactly the same thing. And the more faithful you are to God, the better you are as a king. And my supervisor said, yeah, sounds good. It's too much, though. Drop The Fairy Queen. So I ended up just writing about Mallory and how Mallory represents the relationship between religion and politics, and what holiness means and what political efficacy means in Mallory. And I didn't end up ever writing about either Superman or the Fairy Queen. And so like that whole process just immersed me more and more and more and more and more in Mallory. So when I started my master's, I had taken a course in I knew Arthurian stories well, but I had taken one course in my master's coursework where we read most of Mallory, but we skipped a chunk in the middle. And that was like all I had read of Mallory directly. But then when I wrote my master's, I had to read it pretty closely. And then when I wrote my PhD, I had to read it very, very closely. And then I came out of my PhD kind of obsessed.
So this book has like almost been like a really intense organizing principle for like a lot of your life.
Yeah, for sure.
Which, pulling back the curtain, is kind of why I invited you to talk about it. One of the points of the show is like giving people a chance to talk about the thing that changed their life the most. And I feel like I don't know, most people don't have relationships to a single text, I think, as significant as this one is for you. And like, I think that's so cool.
Yeah, that story is like exactly the kind of thing that the show's premise is like organized around. So that's really amazing.
Yeah. Our teleological purpose has been
right. Yeah.
bringing us to this point.
I find so many people who do literature PhDs, they come out of it and are like, nah, I hate my subject now because I had to spend so much time immersed in it. And my experience is the opposite, that like I came out of my PhD loving Mallory more than I did when I started. And I've kept reading it. Yeah, it's for sure an organizing principle of my life, has become one.
The first time that I read this was in 9th grade. We had my English teacher, I can't remember her name. She was a fabulous teacher, maybe the best teacher I've ever had. She had a PhD in English. I'm not sure I didn't even know back then that people, to get a PhD, you had to have like a focus. I just knew that she was the head of the English department. She made us read Edith Hamilton's mythology that year. Basically, we did like the Western survey, right? So we started with the Greek myths. We moved on to the T.H. White book. Is that Once and Future? Is that the name?
Yeah, the Once and Future King.
We read Once and Future. We read some Tennyson. We read some Morte. And then we read some of the Grail Quest. And so that was my first exposure to this. And then I wanted to read the whole thing after that. And I got kind of bitten by Arthur at that point. Like I was so inspired by that. And at that time I was like, I want to write fantasy. Like I was very caught up in this. And the way she was teaching and explaining Arthur, just like it was blowing my mind. And her whole thing of like, and I asked her, is the Once and Future King, like, did he write the part where he comes back? And she's like, no. And so like I undertook to write that story, and I kept handing in chapters to her, and she was very encouraging and sweet to me. And so I have fond memories of that whole thing. And like writing Arthur was like good practice for me of like how I was trying to imitate Mallory's whole thing that he was doing. I made it very Catholic. I wasn't Catholic at all, but I was like, it needs to be Catholic because this is a Catholic story. So it's very weird. Yeah. And I've just read a lot of Arthur stories since then. I love King Arthur stories and movies based on it. I love all the adaptations. I love how they play with each other. And in reading it this time, that's what my mind was doing as I was going through it, was associating it with all the different versions. I was, a scenario would play out as I was listening. I listened to the audiobook version of this, and I would associate, I'd be like, oh yeah, okay, so in a Robert Jordan story, this kind of same scenario happens with characters that have the same name. And oh yeah, in this other book that I read, this happened. And in this other movie, this thing happened. And that's kind of how I was building associations and networks between the characters, is via the adaptations, which are a little bit easier for me to digest as like a modern person in the 21st century than the language of the story. Even though I like I said, I did get very emotional at the end where the characters are all, and Camelot's falling apart and the characters are dying. I was like, no, you guys, I love you guys.
Yeah, I think my experience with this text is so different from both of yours. I had very little exposure to King Arthur stuff growing up. Like I don't think I even watched the Disney movie. There was like one YA kind of like Merlin-based series that I think I read maybe in middle school, but I could not tell you the name of the book or the author. I would say my first like real exposure other than references through Monty Python was when I took Paul's first Le Morte d'Arthur class called A Fine Romance. And that was like, a month and a half ago or something? 2 months ago. So this is all very new to me. And I'm someone who bounces pretty hard off of old literature, old movies. Like, I think, I always say, like, The Graduate is basically when cinema started for me. I just, like, my brain doesn't really process anything older than that, anything in black and white. And so to be honest, I still haven't read Le Morte d'Arthur. But I did buy the book, and I did listen to all of Paul's lectures, and I have really enjoyed, like, reading around it, I guess. And I read, so Paul made like this short ebook, I think it's like 40 pages or something, that's basically like favorite scenes from King Arthur, but or from Le Morte d'Arthur, but like written in the modern vernacular. And I've laughed out loud multiple times while I was reading it. And again, I guess not having read the original, I don't know like how much of that was your interpretation or just a literal translation. But I really enjoyed that. It's called Maybe If I Pull Harder. And we'll link it in the show notes if people want to buy it. I think it's like $5 or something.
There's an ebook. There's a print version too. Yeah, I would send you a print version.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess just like one of my big takeaways from that class was, I think, especially in the live seminars, you would be like reading from the book and talking about something, and you would just be cracking up, and like the text would be on the screen, and I'd be like, I don't understand why that's funny. And then you would explain it, and I'd be like, oh, okay, I get it. Like, humor, I think, is just so like context dependent, and I think so much of modern humor is really based around wordplay that like the archaic language can kind of get in the way. And so I wouldn't say I'm an Arthur fan yet, but I have really appreciated, or I guess I would say I've developed an appreciation for it kind of secondhand.
People don't think of Le Morte d'Arthur as funny. Even Mallory scholars don't necessarily think of it as funny until you mention it to them. But I think it's hilarious. And I think it's deliberately so. I don't think it's accidentally funny. I think like there's a lot of juxtaposition and subverted expectations and just bizarre things happening that Mallory would have expected his audience to find bizarre and to find the juxtapositions surprising. And as I explained to my child just today, surprise is the root of humor.
Yeah.
Also, dick jokes, I think, are one of the roots of humor. And I'm trying to remember, there's definitely at least one dick joke in Le Morte d'Arthur, right? Wasn't it? Well, because the word sheath, right? Or scabbard is like...
There's a whole thing when Arthur gets the sword out of the lake. There's the sword in the stone, and there's the sword out of the lake where the lady of the lake lifts up her hand, and Arthur gets the sword, and Merlin asks him, which do you like better, the sword or the scabbard? And he says, I like the sword better. And Merlin is like, you should like the scabbard more. That is foolish of you. And there's a kind of multilingual joke because the Latin word for scabbard is vagina.
This is good because like this is the thing that I noticed on this reading, and I wanted to bring it up. So that, like, not specifically this, but definitely that moment was one of the moments that I feel like when I talked about it all being of a piece, the thing that I noticed over and over, and maybe this is just inscribed in the Arthur legend, is that the theme that goes through so much is that things are not what they appear to be.
Mm-hmm.
Like, your assumptions are going to trip you up in this story. And so like sometimes they don't recognize Merlin
mm-hmm.
because he appears differently. He's like shapeshifter, or like in that case,
or something.
It's
I imagine him like
something.
Gene
Yeah.
Parmesan in Arrested Development. He keeps showing up and they're being like, what's going on? He's like, hey, it's me, Merlin! And they're all like, ah! Anyway, sorry, go on.
And then eventually he just vanishes and they're like, whatever happened to that guy? You make these assumptions about, oh, this is, this is some knight I'm going to be able to beat. And then it turns out you're fighting Sir Lancelot. And you're like, oh, no. Like, I'm sworn to, like, I'm your man. What is happening? This is the worst situation that could be happening right now. And so it just seems like there's something about, I don't know if the right way to characterize it is like human arrogance or something, but just like a lack of humility when we approach situations and the consequences of that, and how those can ripple out and become very serious in ways that I don't think play out in other heroic legends quite the same way. Like, usually you'll get characters who like go too far or they're too ambitious, but that's not really the problem with these characters. It's usually that they have a completely reasonable set of assumptions. They're just wrong.
Yeah.
And then like the consequences of that are pretty steep.
That is an aspect that exists in Arthurian legend outside of Mallory, but I do think that Mallory emphasizes it. And one of the effects, like I would actually argue, I mentioned earlier, like, is it one text or not? Who can know? But I would argue that the effect of putting it all between two covers makes it one text no matter what Mallory intended, but creates in the reader a inclination to look for these themes that go, and so you notice these things that continue from beginning to end. And whether Mallory put them there on purpose or not, who knows? No one, we never will know. But they're there. And the human error and misunderstanding, for sure, that ripples out throughout. Like, I think that's exactly something that is emphasized through the whole story. And specifically, I mean, what you said about fighting Lancelot and not knowing that he's Lancelot, or Merlin and not knowing that he's Merlin, like, there are lots of assumptions that characters make wrongly, but the most impactful ones are the ones where they literally don't recognize each other, and the metaphor of that is they can't tell friend from foe. They literally don't know who their friends are. And that's something that is in Arthurian legend outside of Mallory, but I think Mallory really brings to the forefront by the way both that he organizes it and also the kinds of stories that he chooses to tell. Like, one of the things about the organization that I kind of alluded to earlier, but I want to say out loud, is Mallory organizes the text not just in the literal sense of what order he puts them in, but like he chooses some sources and not others. And that shapes how we interpret. I mean, it shapes how he's interpreting, and it shapes how people since have interpreted what the Arthurian story is. There are texts that he had access to that he chose not to use, and I'd say for artistic reasons, and that are connected to creating a cohesive thematic direction for the story. And one of it for sure is, they don't know who their friends are. They make choices based on all the knowledge available to them, but the knowledge available to them isn't all the knowledge that there is, and they are just wrong. And sometimes there's no good choice, or sometimes there are choices that we can recognize afterwards would have been right, but there was no way for the character to know in the moment what they should have done.
Yeah, that's really like driven home at the end, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's kind of an internal plot to commit a coup and replace Arthur on the throne with Mordred. And Arthur sides with Mordred. He sides with the traitor and against the most faithful knight. So he literally doesn't know who his friends and enemies are. And it creates a situation that destroys him and the kingdom.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the way that you're putting that, he doesn't know you can't recognize your friends and your enemies. That, wow. Yeah. You're kind of blowing my mind.
And it's not just that he can't tell whether Mordred is, like, he also can't tell whether Lancelot is his friend, right? Like, it's,
yeah.
And he can't tell who's on his side, and it's from the beginning. And sometimes the fact that he can't tell who's a friend and who's an enemy doesn't always end badly. Sometimes he can't tell, but
Right.
it turns out well anyway. But
Mm-hmm.
it seems to be Arthur especially. I have a friend, Dr. Michaela Hunter, who teaches the Game of Thrones course and the Robin Hood course at Clockworks Academy. I'm got this specific idea from her, but she has studied disguise in medieval literature. And she says, kings are especially bad in general, not just in Arthurian legend. Kings are especially bad at seeing through disguises because it's especially important for kings to know who are their friends. And so they're especially bad at it because it's especially high stakes.
So I guess when I noticed this, I was trying to, and maybe this is inappropriate. I said it earlier about how Catholic the story feels. So when I was thinking about like you're misjudging these situations, or like that maybe there's like some kind of Christian allegoresis to be had there that is like, don't judge others, or don't judge situations. Like you don't have the wisdom, and look at the consequences of your judgments, how they, render the earth unlivable.
Right. That's really good. There's a lot of debate in Mallory's scholarship about how Christian Mallory's perspective is, because some of his sources, and particularly the Grail Quest, seems to have been written by clerical writers making a theological point, and the argument has been that the French Grail Quest, is more concerned with making a theological point than it is with telling a cohesive story.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And so
I think there's something to that.
There's some scholars, especially Viniver, who keeps coming up. He's like the dominating figure in early 20th or in mid 20th century Arthurian scholarship. But Viniver argued strongly that Mallory was secularizing of the story as much as he could. He pulled out the religious significance and the religious points as much as he could. In my thesis, basically my strongest argument was nuh-uh. So I think, and in my thesis argued that Mallory's perspective is religious from the beginning to the end, or as religious as anything else. Like, I don't think that he's like the authors of the Grail Quest making a theological point more than any other point. But I do think that the argument has been made that 15th century religion is such a part of the culture that he uses religious references just because it's in the air without really caring about them. And I have said that no, he actually cares about the religious grounding of the text from the beginning to the end. That's my perspective.
This might be a good point to bring up the allegations against Mallory and like why he was a prisoner. Right, so or at least the Mallory that we think is the Mallory, was accused of rape, although because the meaning of that word has changed, it's unclear if it was actually rape in the modern sense of the word, or if it was more of a consensual affair that then the husband of the woman he was with was not happy with.
Mm-hmm. I've never heard this, but it like is relevant, especially to how the story ends.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to that there's a lot of like pining and yearning and people making bad sexual decisions, I guess, and facing the consequences for them, and that like there's a way to interpret like some of that thematic stuff as like coming from a guy who is currently imprisoned for doing some of those things himself.
Yeah, so Thomas Mallory, the most likely candidate for who wrote Le Morte d'Arthur is Sir Thomas Mallory of Newbold Revel. The preeminent Mallory scholar right now is Peter Field, and he has made a really convincing argument that this is the Mallory who wrote Le Morte d'Arthur. We don't know for sure, but he's made a really strong case. So Sir Thomas Mallory of Newbold Revel was in prison at the right time, and he was in prison for rape. He was convicted of rape, as Anya just said. Like, so he was not accused by the woman, he was accused by her husband. And it was a statute that was specifically put in so that husbands could charge someone who was sleeping with their wife whatever the wife said about it. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it was consensual. It doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't. And there's a lot of grappling that Mallory scholars have to do, that Mallory readers have to do, that like, maybe it's just a whole different guy. I don't think so, but maybe. We don't know that it's the same guy. There's a way of understanding the story, like maybe he and this woman, she was married to someone who she didn't love, and he fell in love with her, and they ran off together, and her husband, with the strength of the law, took her back and sent him to prison, and he's like Lancelot rescuing Guinevere. Right. Or, like, maybe he's a rapist. And in that case, maybe the kind of fixations on sexual ethics in Le Morte d'Arthur, like, maybe they're about how, like, you can read into Le Morte d'Arthur as it's written, like, men control women's sexuality. You can also read there are passages where knights are specifically textually prohibited from enforcing women, which isn't legally the same word as rape, but it's, not in all of the sources. So maybe he's felt guilty and is overcompensating. Maybe he's, like, there's a lot of ways we can hypothetically read it.
And there are a lot of passages and, like, story moments that do seem surprisingly feminist, right? And, like, emphasize that women have agency and choice.
Yeah, absolutely. In Le Morte d'Arthur, if you were to retell the story and remove the women's agency, you would lose a lot of the point of a lot of the stories. Like, throughout the stories, there's often everything from, in small ways, Guinevere is often the moral judge when Lancelot or other knights send misbehaving knights to the court. They often have to stand before Guinevere and she pronounces judgment. To, like, there's an instance of a man who brings his son to be knighted, and he says, "This my son, he's not noble born, but he should be knighted." And then it comes out that it's not really his son. His wife has slept with King Pellinore, and Mallory gives attention to the wife. And, like, he didn't have to. But, like, the wife and what she wanted, and her, at first it says half by force, but then he gives her a greyhound, and it was not, and she wasn't married yet, and she wanted to, and, like, he really spends time in that little moment on her and what she wants and what she chose and why. And throughout, in big moments and in little ones, women are responsible for the direction of the story, and the women's choices are given actual weight that is not necessarily a default. So yeah, that is a definite tangle in Le Morte d'Arthur. Is what do you make of all of that?
And I guess, like, the one that you brought up in class that I was super surprised by, and is, I think, maybe supposed to be a little bit humorous in a way, where, like, the knight and the dwarf are fighting over this one woman's affections, and they, like, go to get it adjudicated, and the person's just like, well, what the fuck does she want?
Yeah, a knight and a dwarf fighting over who gets this woman, and they bring it to Sir Gawain, and Gawain solves the problem by saying, okay, it's like a dog. It's like, he sets it up, and I think it is intended to be funny because of how he sets it up. He's like, okay, you stand over here, you stand over there. She'll go with whoever she wants to.
Right.
And I think it is intended as humorous that, like, guys, how about this? She can go with whoever she wants. That sound good to you? All right, then.
Yeah, I think, like, I remember reading a lot of, like, stuff about when I first got access to, like, a university library, and it was like, wait a minute, like, everything's here? This is amazing. And I read, like, a lot of stuff that was, like, about the Lady of the Lake and Merlin, and how they used to, like, there was all these weird stories about them fighting with each other and hating each other. It was just interesting how that character... I can never say her name, like Nimue or yeah. There's different versions.
Yeah. Nineveh, Nimue, Vivian. These are all the same person.
Right. Yeah. And she is like a very strong magical force, and seems to be like kind of like earthbound in terrestrial, like force of authority, and then Merlin is more like skybound in my mind. Although this is a long time ago when I was like writing my thoughts about this stuff, and maybe I'm just remembering more my thoughts than the actual stories. But it was like there was tension between these characters, and she was kind of picking who the best people for the job were, and he was trying to influence what they did after the fact that they had power. And it wasn't always like the right choices that Merlin was trying to push people towards, but that she seemed to have a greater wisdom than he did. I don't know. It was just interesting how much power there was invested in that character.
I mean, back again to sexual ethics in Mallory. In Mallory, the chief lady of the lake, Nimue, Nineveh, however you want to say it. I say usually Nimue because it's just for no good reason. Merlin falls in love with her or is besotted with her. And Mallory says, would never give her no peace. And he follows her around, and he says to Arthur, like, she's going to trap me underground forever. And Arthur says, but since you know this, can't you avoid it? And Merlin's like, nah. I made a point in the romance course that Anya took with me. I made a point that that is not a Greek tragedy. The future is written in stone. That is... I am not willing to change my behavior, because there are other places where Merlin is able to make prophecies and then things change because of them. But he follows her around, and she can't get him to leave her alone, and eventually she traps him under a rock forever. I remember as a kid reading that and being like, what a horrible, tricky woman who trapped the great Merlin underground. And now as an adult I read it and I'm like, dude, just leave her alone. Like, literally leave her alone. Is all she is asking you to do is leave her alone.
Yeah.
And then
that's
she
definitely
becomes
the energy.
She becomes like the magical authority for the back half, or not half, the back 5/6 of Le Morte d'Arthur. Merlin's not around for very long, really.
Which I found super surprising. I guess just like what I had kind of osmosed from the culture about big powerful wizards. Like, I guess Gandalf was more my like wizard archetype, and I think I was expecting Merlin to be more Gandalf-y, like, you know, very wise, distinct from humans in a really clear way. You know, like just better than humans in basically every way. Whereas it seems like Merlin in Le Morte d'Arthur is like very human, very flawed, you know, goes around harassing women. Like, it just seems more like a human with some magical powers rather than like some, a being that's like completely apart. I don't know how much that comes out in other adaptations, like in the Disney Sword in the Stone.
T.H. White characterizes Merlin very differently from how Mallory does. And T.H. White characterizes many of the characters very differently from how Mallory does, often very conspicuously and always knowingly. White, who wrote The Sword in the Stone and The Once and Future King. He was very, very knowledgeable about Mallory, but the way that he characterizes Merlin is so appealing. And Merlin in Le Morte d'Arthur is not this all-wise character that T.H. White makes. If I was going to hang out with one of them, I would hang out with T.H. White's Merlin any day.
Oh, for sure. Even the Disney one is, and he's kind of like a riff on T.H. White's.
Yeah. Well, the Disney is ostensibly an adaptation of The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White.
Sword and the Stone. Yeah, which is like really like a American parable almost in the way it's constructed. Or maybe I'm totally wrong about that. Like, isn't it related to like the JFK administration self-consciously and?
Maybe. I think it's more. I think it's more the other way around. The JFK administration self-consciously associates itself with Camelot because it was Camelot the musical, which is also based on T.H. White's book, was popular. Was like a big hit when the JFK administration came out. So it was written before JFK.
Oh, in my mind, it definitely wasn't. So yeah, I'm totally wrong about that. I guess, yeah, it just meditates so much on leadership and on government that so I guess when I read it, I was just thinking a lot about, like, it's talking about what good leadership is. Yes. And Merlin especially seems like self-consciously like informed by political theory and philosophy and things like that, and is trying to teach this stuff to Arthur, who's like, yeah, but what if we just hit people really hard?
I am almost as obsessed with the Once and Future. No, it's not really true, but I love the Once and Future King very much. He was interrupted in writing the Once and Future King by World War II, so he started it before, he ended it after. And when he was almost done, he wrote in a letter that he has had a sudden insight into the central theme of the text of Mallory, that the whole thing is an antidote to war. And so he goes back, T.H. White does, and rewrites the Once and Future King with that in mind. And whether that's an accurate read of Mallory or not, it is I think, certainly a read of Mallory that you would be inclined to right after World War II, that Mallory is, according to T.H. White, Mallory is trying to work out a way to avoid war. Mm-hmm. And so the Once and Future King is consciously about an antidote to war, and how do we avoid war. And the War of the Roses ended literally a month after Mallory finished Le Morte d'Arthur. So Mallory was also writing while his country was at war, and a war that seemed... the War of the Roses, the 100 Years' War, was also really recent history. But the War of the Roses, how many people actually... How bloody it was is unknown. But it's called a war. It may have been more skirmishy and infighting. But... Mallory definitely is himself writing while his country is at war, and while people are thinking a lot about what's a good king look like, and do you become king by being better at war than your enemy? And the book ended before he could see how the War of the Roses ended, which was you end the War of the Roses by being better at war. That's how you get to become king. That's how Henry VII became king, is he stabbed really hard. Yeah. And I think that the read that, especially the end of Le Morte d'Arthur, that like, there must be some other way of deciding how to be king.
Right.
I don't think you have to be living right after World War II to find that in the end of Mallory. We've mentioned a couple of times that Anya took my first Mallory course, A Fine Romance. I've divided Mallory into 3 because I decided it was too long to try to teach it as one course. The first one was The Fine Romance. The last one, which is coming up at the end of July, is called The Quest for the Holy and is all about the Holy Grail. But the second one that I'm in the middle of teaching right now, and so it's on the front of my mind, is all about war and kingship. And so I'm thinking a lot about that, like, day by day right now, is what exactly is Mallory's attitude towards war and kingship, and how you become a good king, and what a good king does.
Well, and in the Fine Romance course, we did talk a bit about knights and what it means to have a bunch of, like, heavily armed macho dudes just like wandering around all the time, getting into fights with each other.
Right.
And how like the structure of chivalry is kind of like a way to control and rein in that male aggression.
Yeah, for sure. We did talk about that, and it's also like a central concern of Mallory, of Arthurian literature, of chivalric romance and literature in general. As a practical necessity, you have to come up with some kind of social mechanism to restrain the violence of heavily armed, entitled people with horses and armor and swords who can probably kill anyone they want to, and there's not much we can do about it. So we have to create a narrative context that prevents them from doing it. Well, and we are learning right now in the world, and especially in the United States, that a lot of police is basically they don't kill people if they don't want to. And that the stories that we've told ourselves about regulation restraining them aren't really true. It's more narrative that restrains them. And so we need to kind of, as a society, rethink that narrative and find ways to change how we conceive of who police actually are, because we, I think, are seeing object lessons over and over that if police want to kill someone, they will.
Yep.
And there's something similar, like knights are not cops, but if a knight wants to kill a peasant, he probably will. So there's a lot of necessary effort put into narratives that convince knights that they don't want to kill peasants.
Oh my god.
And that's really what chivalry is.
You just blew my mind with the idea of knights as cops and how, like, yeah, the structures.
I don't want to think of knights as cops because I like knights.
Well, there's definitely a moment where it was in the later part of the narrative, and Lancelot has been like away, like, you know, nobody knows where he is, and he's making his way back to the kingdom, and I think he was getting a ride from either a cart, right? Or yeah, and he just like up and kills the guy because he won't like answer his question. He just gets up, he hits him really hard. It, you know, says like he gave him a mighty blow and the man fell down dead. And then he looks at the other cart, right? And he's like, "Can we go now?" And the guy's like, yeah. Which way? Where do you want to go? And I was like, Lancelot, stop. What are you doing? You just turned into a bad guy. But the story really didn't treat it that way. It was like, that guy should not have been talking back to Lancelot. And so, like, yeah, it's just interesting where the ethics of the power dynamics.
This is one of the things that I love about T.H. White's characterization that I don't think is actually in Mallory, or you have to dig pretty deep to see it in Mallory. But in T.H. White, Lancelot is a sadist. And T.H. White says that, you know, Lancelot just enjoys hurting people. But he feels bad about wanting to and enjoying hurting people, so he counteracts that desire in himself by really being a chivalrous knight more than any other chivalrous knights are. So T.H. White,
that's why he's like that.
Why he's the greatest knight ever is because he recognizes in himself that he needs to be restrained.
Right.
He likes hurting people, so he follows the rules of chivalry really carefully, so that he won't hurt people because he knows that it's wrong even though he likes doing it. And I think, although that's T.H. White, not Mallory, I think you can read that back into like the structure of chivalry in general. And that's where you see the Morte d'Arthur as an attempt to find an antidote to war, not just on a macro scale, but also to find an antidote to violence. It's a possible read. I think it's a possible way of understanding. All chivalry romances are about finding a way to deal with and restrain violence.
Like, as we're talking about this, it also reminds me of the Mark Twain adaptation, which just kind of basically says they were all sadists.
Yeah.
And then it like very kind of pessimistically posits that that's people.
Wait, Mark Twain did an adaptation of Arthur?
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's like a time travel
Night
book.
in King Arthur's Court.
Oh.
A Connecticut Yankee.
A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Yeah,
that's right. And then it got made into a really goofy movie.
There's many movies of it, actually. Okay. Yeah, it's, there's like the Disney A Kid in King Arthur's
That's
Court,
the one I'm thinking of. Okay.
There's the one with Martin Lawrence where he goes.
Yes.
I don't know what that's called. I haven't seen it, but
it's like Black Knight or something like that. Yeah. Yeah. Which is another fish out of water. Like, that's a way to do that story. It's kind of a fish out of water. Yeah, there's a bunch of versions of that story, but I think Mark Twain's version basically says that, like, we think as moderns we are so like evolved and smart and like peaceful now because we're modern, right? And ancient people were savages and barbarians. And he goes back in time and he teaches the Arthurians like how to make guns. He is just as savage, the Connecticut Yankee, as any of these brutal knights. Mm-hmm. There's nothing romantic about it. And the whole thing is like very dark by the end.
Yeah. It's specifically a pushback against Tennyson.
Yeah.
Tennyson, who's very, very romantic in his representation of Arthur's court, more so than Malory is, for sure.
So in your book about Malory,
Maybe if I pull harder, which is so titled, can I just tell the joke that someone shows up in Arthur's court and she has a sword strapped around her waist? She says, only a knight without deceit will be able to remove the sword. And Arthur says, removing swords is totally my thing. Let me do it. And maybe if I pull harder, says Arthur. Sorry.
Yeah.
I have to tell my own joke.
No, that was also a favorite moment from the book. There's a section in that book about Palamedes and basically like the other knights kind of bringing up the fact that he's a Saracen, being a little bit uncomfortable about it. And I guess there's, been a lot of debate and discourse recently about how white supremacists, both like purposeful and accidental, will often harken back to like historical realism for like why things have only white people. And then, there have been people pushing back against that and saying like, no, actually like medieval Europe was more diverse than you think. Palamedes is clearly not white, right? Like he's either Arab or black or something that is like, he's like visually and culturally distinct from the Anglo-Saxon people around him.
Yeah, I mean, probably. The short answer is, yeah, totally. The longer answer is, yeah, probably. Race, as I'm sure you are already aware, I think I've even heard you talk about in this podcast, race is a social construct, not a biological reality. So race is made up. And it was made up at a point. Like, it hasn't always existed as a concept. And there were, in the 15th century, people with all kinds of skin tones and from all kinds of places. And it's absolutely true that in 15th or 14th or 13th or 12th or 10th, I could say numbers, century England, there are people there from not there.
Yeah.
There are people with a variety of skin tones walking around England in 1470. And in the imaginary England that Malory is writing about. So in medieval literature, Saracen is a word that we usually interpret as meaning Muslim, but it has a bit of the same semantic range that we sometimes see Muslim used as if it's interchangeable with Arab, although it isn't, right? And so some writers clearly distinguish, some writers don't. Palamedes is a religious Saracen. Is he racially distinct from the other knights around him? Probably, but Malory doesn't do a lot of physical description, and certainly doesn't tell us what color anyone's skin is. Palamedes has two brothers who this does not get made a big deal about. They are converts. End of story. They're converts, and we don't talk about them as Saracen knights.
Converts
Palamedes
to Christianity?
To Christianity.
Okay,
to Christianity.
okay.
Yes, sorry. So Saracen seems to be a religious marker primarily in Mallory, but I think we should recognize that although it's inaccurate, it happens.
Yeah.
In the same way as today, if you have a character who is Muslim, that does not necessarily say anything about their race, but a lot of readers are going to read it as if it does. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
Well, there for sure are knights who aren't from the island of Britain. Like, even Lancelot isn't.
Yeah, that's like part of the point, right?
Yeah.
Is that they're from all over Christendom. Or beyond Christendom.
And beyond Christendom. And there are for sure knights who are not Christian. And Palamedes is the one who is in King Arthur's court, but they also fight against some knights who aren't Christians. And there's knights who are from Ind, which in the Middle Ages is not the political entity of India, but it means like generally Southern Asia, a huge range. So Ind could be anything to all the way to like Southern China. But there's characters, and we don't necessarily know. And they're characters who are like him of Ind, and then he has 3 brothers and they're not of Ind. And so does that mean that they're all from India, or did this one character go to Ind, or like why is he of Ind? And Ind is also a color. Like indigo.
Right, indigo.
So maybe he's just wearing blue.
Yeah.
We can't really know for sure. So Palamedes is a Saracen. I think he's not white. The text doesn't seem to care whether he's white or not, but it does care that he's not a Christian.
Yeah, because I don't think it mattered.
No.
The point is that these are the greatest knights of the world,
Yes.
right?
I see.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's important that he is not Christian, that he is like coming from somewhere else, because
yeah, these are like the Avengers,
Yeah.
right? They're the best of the best, all together, working together to one end.
Palamedes does convert to Christianity eventually. He says for a lot of the story, and there's like, again, we could go on, and we won't, because we could talk about it for hours and hours. But Palamedes pretty early says that he's a Christian in his heart, but he hasn't been baptized because, and then there's a couple of different because I'm not going to be baptized until I win the love of Isolde. And then when Isolde is like, I am never going to love you ever, he's like, well, then I'm not going to be baptized until I win 7 battles. And then and then at one point he fights Tristram, and Tristram is like, listen, enough of this. I am taking you to be baptized right now because I almost killed you and I don't want to send you to hell forever.
he's like a master procrastinator.
Yeah. Master procrastinator. Say that 3 times fast. Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the narrative of white supremacists, that the past was all white, and it is sometimes tied up in like that's when things were good, but sometimes it's used as like, so we should never ever have any people of color in any old thing. And I'm glad you brought that up, just for like, no, that's not accurate at all.
Yeah.
In fact, we've mentioned, it's not the topic of this today, but we've mentioned Gawain and the Green Knight a few times. I wrote a paper once that said the Green Knight is Arab, or is based on Arabic legend. The Green Knight is also like, he's physically green, so
Right. He's like a green man.
He's a green man, but it's a confluence of Celtic and Saracen, that is to say Arab in this case, representations of the other. So it's like any kind of other is the same as every other kind of other. So if you're Celtic or you're Arab, it does not matter.
Isn't there a movie coming out now about the Green Knight, and it casts Dave Patel in the lead role?
As
Yeah.
Gawain.
Yes,
Right.
that's going to be
Yeah.
I mean,
It looks great.
I haven't seen it obviously, but I'm so excited about that movie.
Yeah.
It looks really good.
Did you find that decision very validating?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, there's no actual necessarily reason why Gawain is white. There actually isn't. He's related to King Arthur, but we don't know that King Arthur's white, actually. And also, he has 2 parents.
Yeah.
So, like, he's Arthur's nephew. His mother is Arthur's sister. Just as race is a cultural construction, masculinity and femininity are cultural constructions. The masculinity in Le Morte d'Arthur is very constructed, but it's along different lines from 21st century masculinity. And the part of 21st century masculinity where men aren't allowed to have feelings, unless it's anger, that's just not there yet. In fact, in a lot of, I don't think necessarily in Le Morte d'Arthur, but in a lot of medieval literature, like, men have bigger feelings than women.
Yes.
Riding around on your horse weeping so everyone can hear, that is manly.
Right.
Like,
what
and not
could be
feeling,
more manly than that?
What could be more manly than... It's one of these moments, this is a moment that I'm not sure is intended for humor, but I find really funny, is there's a couple of points. There's one where a knight, like, just rides past Arthur in his court, wailing. And I just imagine him, like, riding on his horse, crying loudly, riding past, and everyone's like... What's that guy's deal? And then Arthur sends some people after him to find out. But people do that, like ride through the woods crying, because of how masculinity is constructed in England in the 15th century. Like, that's a very manly thing to do. It would be much less manly if your heart is broken and you don't react.
I never thought that I would be in the position of saying, let's bring back traditional masculinity, but I feel like this is a strong argument for it.
Right? Like, it wasn't all good. But I think that modern masculinity is especially impoverished in its conception.
Is there anything else you want to say about this book, Paul, before we wrap up?
Well, how much time do you have? I want to, before we end, mention a bit. This will be a little bit self-serving as a plug, but my 3 courses, A Fine Romance, Fight for Right, and The Quest for the Holy, I want to mention that I broke it up that way for convenience, but it's also kind of how I see the 3 main thematic strands of Le Morte d'Arthur. It is really true that the whole book is a romance, and it's about love, and romance doesn't always necessarily mean a love story, but it is both a romance in the medieval sense of it is about adventure and knights having personal individual struggles, and also in the modern sense that it's a love story and another love story and another love story, and it's about broken hearts and
so many love triangles.
So many love triangles, and Lancelot and Guinevere and Arthur's love triangle is like a driving force through the center of the story. And then entwined in all of that, it is also this story of chivalric ethics and war and kingship and how do you fight and how do you restrain violence, and is there an appropriate way to be violent? And yes, there probably is, but maybe there's not, and it's all about like war and fighting. And then entwined in all of that is the 3rd strand of holiness, that it's about personal piety, and especially the Grail quest, but then that cascades backwards, that it's both about how to construct a faithful society, but it's also, especially in the Grail quest, about how an individual acts in the world in a way that's faithful to their god. And that's something that the whole text is concerned with all the way through. And one of the things I love about Le Morte d'Arthur is the way those 3 things... I for the sake of my course, I pulled them apart from each other, and now I'm going to say, you can't pull them apart from each other. That they're all like tripping over each other and wound up in each other in so fascinating ways. We started off saying that maybe these are different tales that are just kind of put next to each other and aren't really the same story beginning to end. One of the things that I said at some point back there, by virtue of being in between 2 covers, it creates a thematic unity for the reader to find. One of the things that I think is an inadvertent effect is these like inconsistent characterizations and these divergent ideas. I actually think that ends up making the story more human and more deep and even more realistic, because real life humans are not consistent in their characterization. And there are these inconsistencies and in how people behave and how people present themselves, and presenting all these variants right next to each other so that we, the readers, just have to make sense of it, I think is part of what gives Mallory so much depth, because taking two different stories that were written in different contexts for different purposes and just putting them next to each other and being like, okay, make sense of this.
Right.
I think we can make sense of it, and it creates this level of depth that I don't think we should underestimate, and is one of the reasons why I love Mallory so very much.
I think we've already talked a lot about how this book has impacted you and what you think about it, but what has been your experience recommending it to other people, and is it something that you would necessarily recommend, that your average person just kind of like pick up and try and read through? Like, what recommendations do you have along those lines?
Honestly, I recommend it a little bit hesitantly, because it depends on the person. Because it is the only work of medieval literature read widely by non-specialists for pleasure, because it's so late, unlike something like Chaucer, it's usually just put in front of people exactly as it is, and it is readable as it is, but not necessarily easily. So I do recommend it to people. I would recommend it to people, but I can't hide, and I wouldn't want to hide, that it's a bit of a commitment. And it's not the easiest hill to climb. So I know when I recommend to just like a person, hey, you should read Morte, they're like, uh-huh.
What edition or like editor would you recommend for someone who maybe listened to this podcast and is like, okay, that sounds interesting enough, I want to give it a stab? Because I know, like the original manuscript in Caxton, it has that medieval approach to spelling, which is to say it varies wildly, but there are some editions that try and like standardize things more to make it a smoother reading experience.
I think one of the most readable editions, it's lightly abridged, but I think still worth reading if you want to just pick it up and read it like it's a novel, is the Oxford World Classic edition, which is edited by Helen Cooper. The audiobook version is always a good choice. That'll always be Caxton's edition, because the Winchester edition, the Winchester manuscript is out of copyright, but the edition based on it was recent enough that it's still under copyright, believe it or not. So Morte d'Arthur is not public domain yet in the Winchester edition. Someone would have to do a whole new edition to do an audiobook, and no one wants to. So any audiobook version you'll get will be Caxton, which will mean you'll miss the Roman War episode, mostly. I like the Winchester manuscript better, so I generally recommend that people find something that says Winchester on it. Helen Cooper's is abridged. If you want a full, unabridged version, Dorsey Armstrong has an edition that has modernized spelling, and then on the facing page, the original text.
Oh, I love that kind of thing.
Me too. That's one of the reasons why I really like Seamus Heaney's Beowulf, is that it does that. I think probably there are some editions that don't, but my edition of Seamus Heaney's Beowulf has the Old English on one page and the translation on the other, and I loved it when I first read it for that reason. There's an edition by Shepherd, which is the Norton edition, that is not very accessible, but really fun, because he does what almost no one does, which is the Winchester manuscript has some words written in red and the rest in black, and Shepherd uses a different font for the red words, which gives you, like, there's no other edition, even scholarly editions, that do that. So that's a lot of fun if you're up for a bit of a challenge. And if you really want, I mean, again, this is self-serving, but really what I recommend, if you want to get the experience of Morte d'Arthur, is you take my courses, and I'll walk you through it. And there's 3 of them. The third one is, when this podcast comes out, the third one will be in the future, but the first 2 will repeat. So you can find those courses on my website, and I think that reading it with someone is a good choice for a lot of people. I mean, like, I don't want to talk down to people. If you want to read it, it's readable, but it can be a bit because it is in Middle English, not in Modern English. So it's more different than, Shakespeare. It's actually technically a different language, and it can be a bit intimidating, and it can be a bit of a grind for people if you're not expecting it or used to it or prepared for it.
So I can say I really enjoyed the course. I did none of the signed reading. I just watched the...
Good thing it's not graded.
Yeah. I just watched the video lectures. And of course, like, the lectures themselves referred to a lot of passages of the text. So I did kind of, read bits and pieces as we went through. As someone who I think has never really enjoyed reading old stuff, but I really enjoy talking about and learning about the history and the context of all that old stuff. Finding a way to relate to medieval humans as humans, even though they talk funny, I found it really rewarding that way.
I would also really recommend The Once and Future King by T.H. White. It is not Mallory, but he is very knowledgeable about Mallory, and you will get a good sense of the story and the characters and even a lot of the themes. It's an adaptation. It's its own thing, but it's still worth reading.
I've also taken a Clockworks Academy class. I took Frankenstein class.
Frankenstein was the first one I did, but I think you took the very first course I ever taught at Clockworks Academy. That was great.
It was so good.
Thank you.
And yeah, I mean, I've listened to your podcast, so I was very familiar with how smart you were. And it was like any question that I would ask Paul, he would be like, if either he knew the answer or he'd be like, I'll get back to you, and then gave like very thorough, wonderful, thoughtful answers that really like helped me to understand a text that I had read, a couple of times by then. I even took like a college class where I read Dracula, Frankenstein, and Le Morte Arthur. It was like a fantasy literature class. And so I've been taught by people these exact texts, and Paul like pulled out all kinds of stuff that like I had never even heard of. It was so good. It's basically just sign up for his stuff. Like we've been in his Discord lately, like taking up too much space, arguing about like fascism and fantasy in medieval idiom, Tolkien and George R.R. Martin. There's like lots of smart people there talking about all kinds of smart stuff. So you should get into that community.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I agree, you should.
So join us next month for an episode on the now classic YA book series Animorphs by Catherine Applegate. And we're going to particularly focus on book number 19, The Departure. And we'll be doing that with a guest poetry. I kind of love that just by the coincidence of schedule, these two episodes ended up back to back. Because I think, Le Morte Arthur, a text from literally the 15th century, paired with, I think, a YA fantasy book series that a lot of people overlook as just kind of like, cheesy genre fiction for kids. But they actually both have a lot of unexplored depths. So I read Animorphs as like a 5th, 6th grader, but I don't think I've revisited it since, puberty. So I'm really excited for this. This is going to be fun. Okay, well, don't forget to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts if you like what we do. Paul, where can our listeners find you?
You can find me on twitter.com at thatpaulmoffat. That's Moffat with 2 F's, 1 E, and 2 T's. You can find my website is clockworksacademy.com, and that's where you can find out more about the courses that I teach, and you can buy the Maybe If I Pull Harder book if you would like to.
I'm Anya, and you can follow me on Twitter at StrangelyLiteral. That's Strangely, then Literl.
I'm Alan. You can follow the show on Twitter at HG Storycast. visit our website at hgstorycast.com.
If you'd like to leave us feedback, you can visit hgstorycast.com/contact or send an email to contact@hallowedgroundmedia.com. Hallowed Ground Storycast is a Hallowed Ground Media production and is produced under a Creative Commons non-commercial share-alike license.